Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest in a series of talks that the Oxford Martin School is organising, prompted by the recent Dasgupta review on the economics of biodiversity. My name is Charles Godfray. I'm the director of the Oxford Martin School, and I'm delighted to have here with me this afternoon a colleague and friend, Henrietta Moore, Dame Henrietta Moore. Henrietta is a social anthropologist. She's worked in many universities, Durham, Cambridge, LSE, but is in UCL, University College London at the moment, part of the Bartlett School, where she is the director of the Institute of Global Prosperity. Henrietta has many honours. She's a fellow of the British Academy, and in 2016 she was made a Dame for her contributions to social science. Henrietta, welcome to this talk. I was going to begin by asking you to tell us a little bit about your journey. You're a social anthropologist. You've done lots of work on gender, field anthropology in Africa. And I know that you've become very interested in biodiversity and other aspects of the natural world, well, throughout your career, but especially in recent years. Tell us a bit about the course of your career.
Yes, well, Charles, lovely to be here and lovely to be part of this discussion, and pleased to be with everyone. So I think the best thing to say is really that I always held this very strong interest in the human-environment relationships ever since I did my PhD in social anthropology, which was in northwest Kenya. And there I was very interested in the intimate relationship between smallholder livelihoods and people and place. And one of my abiding memories, actually, of doing field work was bumping along a very narrow road in a Land Rover, going up and down through huge potholes, and being overtaken on the inside by a giraffe, which was doing rather better than I was. And so that sense of being in the physicality of place was a really important part of the work that I was doing. And of course, what's evolved since then is a sense really of loss, of emergency, of the pressing nature of the changes that have taken place, and not just as I experience them, but as everybody in that part of Kenya, which is called Elgeyo Marakwet, how all my friends there experience what's happened over the last 30 years or so, more than that now. And, you know, the main thing, of course, has been massive deforestation, soil erosion, and great biodiversity loss. And the area where I work is part of the Great Rift, so it's part of the Rift Valley. And, you know, in the time in living memory, that place would have been teeming with animals and birds and all kinds of things, including the pollinators on which so much of the ceremonial life of those people depends, which is all about collecting honey and making honey beer out of it. And so people themselves have felt a great sense of loss. And I think that's the thing that sent me on the journey, is being attached to that place in a very important way.
I know that part of Kenya, and I visited it over 30 years, and just extraordinary the change that has happened over that time.
Yeah, amazing.
I was also going to ask you, before we get on to the Dasgupta report, to tell us a little bit about your work in the Institute of Global Prosperity. And in particular, I know that you have written a lot about issues about how we measure progress and the tyranny of GDP and better ways of measuring societal well-being. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think what's interesting there is that from different disciplines, including economics itself, there is a great pressure at the moment for a paradigm change in economic thinking. So perhaps the easiest way to think about it is to say, you know, what really is an economy for, and who is it for? And if you measure economic progress in terms of GDP, you very often end up in that situation where we've had massive growth in economies. We've had great growth in human capital over the last 40 years. But when you look around you, what you see is increasing inequality. So you don't see the benefits of so-called trickle down, or the benefits supposed to be with, you know, rising tides raise all boats and so on and so forth. What you actually see is a widening gap between people. And that is translating in contemporary society, of course, into a great deal of disquiet and real anger. And I think probably many people are aware of that, the sort of rise of populism and lack of trust in government, lack of interest, in fact, even in proper governance. And most recently, of course, in the last year with the pandemic, really a sense that politicians are not dealing in a straightforward way with people, that their word cannot be trusted. And that is very, very corrosive in human society if you have that level of mistrust. So what we've been doing in the Institute is we've been working in a very detailed way with communities in the UK, in Africa, in Cuba, and in Lebanon, talking to them about what really matters to them. What is quality of life? Where would they like to see improvements in quality of life? And generally, when you take a sort of standard economic framework, people just say, well, it's about creating jobs. Everybody has to have a job and everybody has to have an income. And of course, that's very important to people. But when you talk to people about what do they really want, they say what they want is a degree of security of what we would call, perhaps you and I, livelihood. So it isn't, so work is important. Yes, income is important, but so are infrastructures, working public services, good quality housing, good quality green spaces, the capacity to have a say about how things are run, and an ability to live well with others. And that becomes very important. So we've been developing a way of what we call the first citizen-led prosperity index. Because as you clearly understand, there are many of these different kind of indices around the world. There's the Human Development Index, there's the Social Progress Index. There are so many of them. In fact, you can hardly move for indices at the moment. And that in itself is a good thing, because it means that people everywhere are recognizing that we are not quite measuring what we value. And the question is, what is the good way of doing it? And of course, as being an anthropologist, I'm interested in how to develop an index that can actually understand and record the major structural constraints that are bearing down on people's lives. So, for example, in the UK, something like deindustrialization or mental health, those kinds of things, but combine it with something that speaks to what people in their local areas really matters and what they really want to see change and progress in.
And just a plug for people who are interested in this topic, we've had previous conversations and lectures from people like Diane Coyle from Cambridge and Paul Collier here at Oxford talking about these things, and they're available on the Martin School archive. Henrietta, in a perfect world, how would you like to see a government take an indices such as you've developed, or one of these other ones, and actually operationalize it, turn it into how would it work when Treasury comes to make a cost-benefit decision, which now they largely do using economic criteria?
Yes. Well, this is one of the things that we've been discussing with Treasury and with others. And I think the first thing to say about it is, if I had my way, just take the United Kingdom for a moment, by the time of the next general election, every area of the United Kingdom would have its own prosperity index in the hands of local people who would understand whether or not they were making progress towards any of these quality of life indicators that matter to them, and how that intersects with macroeconomic policy. So there's an educational element to it. There is an element that's also about, if you like, democratic participation and voice. And I think one of the things that would have to happen in the United Kingdom, because we are a very, very centralized polity, is we'd have to have much more devolution than we currently have, much more decentralization. And so we've already working right across the UK in several boroughs in London, but also in Leeds and in Liverpool and in Glasgow and other places, developing these local-based prosperity indices. So one of the reasons why this is important is because so much of government policy, which has been aimed at levelling up the regions, and everyone is very familiar at the moment with this discussion around levelling up and building back better, is that actually most government policy aimed at doing that in the last 40 years has been fantastically unsuccessful. And one of the reasons is because it insists on seeing these things as working through a kind of technological innovation. So it says, well, we'll bring a massive new factory producing whatever it is to Wales, and this will create lots and lots of jobs for Wales. But what tends to happen in these kinds of situations is that the number of jobs created is tiny. So most people are not going to be employed in one of these high-end, new, shiny kinds of factories for producing whatever it is, doesn't really matter. And so constant disappointment and constant move of money into areas which is not actually really doing anything for local people. It might be doing good things overall for the economy or good things for innovation, but actually what it's doing for local people is not providing them with any more livelihood security.
So this is a huge issue at the moment in the UK with the levelling up agenda and in many other countries as well. So what concrete would you like to see the government doing more of? I mean, it's struggling at the moment to put flesh on the concept of levelling up.
It is, and I've been writing quite a bit about that, and we've had a campaign for the UK, which we've been running in the last few months, called Rebuilding Prosperity for the UK. And the way I want to think about it is something that I've learned from the work that I've done in areas to do with environment and biodiversity, and that is to get local areas and indeed local authorities to take a kind of whole systems approach to what needs to change in their area. In other words, instead of thinking about, okay, we need more jobs, or okay, we need better health service, is to actually put these things together and say, okay, what do we need across these intersecting systems to take a kind of ecological approach to the economy at the local level, and then to see how you address some of the major top 5-6 challenges that are in those areas through a combination of local employment and investment. And so we're building models for that using the Prosperity Index right now. So there are very concrete things that we can do, I think. But it's what's interesting about that kind of approach is that many of the jobs that you will actually create by addressing some of the issues that people care about, for example, lack of green spaces, so no parks or not properly looked after, or very poor quality of buildings for schools, or not enough social care and so on. All those kinds of jobs are what you call reasonably moderate skill entry kinds of jobs. So you're not having to wait for the whole of the area to have a whole new set of skills and a whole new education and so forth. You can actually begin to tackle problems at root. And a lot of sort of decarbonisation issues can be dealt with using those kinds of approaches in the UK.
And also talk very much to the sense of place, which we tend to have lost. I'll move on to the Dasgupta report. Just before I do that, can I ask our audience to feel free to ask questions. If you look at your screen, you should see down on the bottom right an Ask a Question tab. I see there are already 2 questions there. Do ask questions. You can also vote for questions that you particularly would like me to put to Henrietta. And please do vote, because that's really helpful for me in picking the questions to choose. So Henrietta, the Dasgupta report.
Yeah.
And I guess one of the highlight conclusion and recommendations that comes out of the Dasgupta report that talks very much to some of the measures we've just been talking about over the last 10 minutes is the need for all countries and globally to think much more about inclusive wealth. And as I understand it, that is the combination of what we traditionally think of as the produced capital, the stock of materials we have, human capital, which we're used to thinking about labor, and then also natural capital. And I wonder if you might say a little bit about what you think the main messages of the Dasgupta report are on that, and perhaps how also how you view it as a social anthropologist, and it meshes with some of the ideas we've just been chatting about.
Well, yeah, I know, I'm very happy to. I think, firstly, what I'd like to say is that that the Dasgupta report itself is a wonderfully elegant working out of a really difficult conceptual problem, which is how do you incorporate these issues of natural capital in a way that would actually make them actionable by governments, and in a way in which they could actually incorporate them not only into their thinking, but actually into their policy making. But the slight difficulty we have here, I think, is that we have to understand that what Potter has done is to create another essentially aggregate figure. So putting those 3 capitals together. And his view, and he argues it very carefully in the report, is that inclusive wealth and social well-being are equivalent for the purposes of sustainability assessment and policy analysis. So they're the same thing, essentially. And so what you would do...
And sorry, just to interrupt there, the same thing by definition, or the same thing because they're measuring the same thing?
The same thing because they're measuring the same thing. Yeah, that's right. And he makes an argument for that. So one of the issues that you could take up, and people have taken up with the Dasgupta report, is in what sense is that true, or is it sufficiently the case to warrant action on that grounds? But he makes a very elegant argument for it, I think. And I would urge anyone who's interested actually just to look at the main report itself, which is huge, but a very good read. A very good read. Not in bed though, too heavy.
But very elegantly written. It's an easy read.
Yeah, it's an easy read. It's an easy read. But the difficulty we have with so let's just say one thing about a difficulty with it. So one of the things that Pato acknowledges, but of course can't resolve in the report, and this speaks to the work that we're doing in the Institute, is that as an aggregate figure, it's much more useful than GDP, which discounts anything to do with the natural world effectively. It's not interested in it. But as with GDP, because it's an aggregate figure, it does not reflect distribution across people. In other words, it doesn't incorporate inequalities, and particularly systemic inequalities of any kind, right? So you would be dealing with not understanding how it applies to the specifics of place. That's one of the difficulties. It would be very, very difficult to use it to do that. So in order to actually operationalize it, you would need to marry it together with something like the Prosperity Index to make it actually speak to the specifics of place itself. And this is important because the ecological crisis is itself fundamentally an inequality crisis at so many different levels. Because, first of all, because those who are experiencing the sharp end, or much of the sharp end of climate change and biodiversity loss, are not those whose actions have been driving these changes at the sort of planetary level, to put it bluntly. So you in Africa has not been causing these actions, and with its consumption patterns, they have been caused elsewhere. And it's also an inequality crisis across the generations, which is something that Pato is very concerned about. One of the things he wants to do is to be able to hold governments to account using this notion of inclusive wealth. In other words, to educate the current generation and the following generations to understand that you need to say to government, okay, so what is this going to do for inclusive wealth, this project or this policy or this particular government management of the economy? Where will it take us? Will it actually be an improvement in inclusive wealth or not? So that there has to be work for distributive justice in his thinking, but he cannot say what that is, because in a way, this is where so much of the work we do, as you know very well in your own work, is about working in this quite novel kind of transdisciplinary way where we actually have to get together to solve these problems, both at the intellectual level, but also at the sort of practical policy level too. I think we need to bring different people to the table to make these kinds of decisions now, or as to how to go forward.
I certainly found that some of the writings on inequality in the report were fascinating. And I guess one immediately thinks about, if one thinks about the different asset classes, then clearly people differ in their material wealth, and we know all about that. The complicated issue about disparities in skills and human capital, and actually what that's doing to the country with the a shifting political divide now going along along an educational dimension. But I not that I'd really appreciated some of the disparities in natural capital. And I guess I got two messages from that, from the report. One is sort of even within the country, then people have different local natural capital wealth. And I thought the point that Pato made, well, all of you made very well, was that much of our trade and actually much of our the ways we have offshored some of our, for example, greenhouse gas emissions, has been almost an exploitation of natural capital in low-income countries, which in many ways can make us look good.
Yes, and I think we all of us ought to be, and especially those of us who are working in this area and or learning in it, you know, so those students and so on are coming into the Oxford Martin School and to the Institute of Global Prosperity, very, very attentive to some of these issues which are about offsetting of various kinds, right? Because I think that, you know, some of them will be important and will work, you know, at both at the global level and at the national level. But many of them are just a way of being able to carry on doing what you're currently doing and feel slightly less bad about it. And I think one needs to be careful there, very careful.
Now, you'll be aware that there are some people who really hate the notion of economics and being mixed with biodiversity, and argue that biodiversity is literally invaluable, and so economic thinking doesn't work. I think Partha has a really sophisticated response to that objection. But I was wondering how you as a social anthropologist respond when people say, no, you can't make something as wonderful and as inalienable as nature and quotidian economic thinking.
Yes, and I understand this apprehension really well. And I mean, it's not just that you know, nature is something that's fundamental for all of us, but for many people around the world, it's something that's sacred as well. And so, you know, putting a monetary value on it really, really doesn't help. And I think two things to be said. Well, so as you say, Partha has this sophisticated way of dealing with it, because basically what he says is you have to understand these three forms of capital as having what he calls in economic terms an accounting value. So you've got, that is the value which is the market price plus the social worth or the social scarcity value, right? And he understands that social worth as the contribution that an additional unit of it would make to societal well-being. So he's trying here to incorporate a notion of social worth, including even such things as ritual worth. And he gives some very good examples in the report for Benin, for example, talking about, you know, the number of sacred groves that are no longer there and what's happened to people's cultural life. So that when he talks about diminution in natural capital over time, he's also aware that he's talking about diminution in cultural capital for many, many peoples of the world. And that's a very important sort of contribution. So he has come quite a long way to taking into account all of these social issues. But I think the important thing that we need to focus on here is what will make a change. So how can we get governments to act on this? And how can we get governments to act on it in a way that we, the ordinary citizen, can actually follow and understand? And I think that here his contribution with economic thinking is to try to make economics more relevant to the ordinary citizen in the contemporary situation. So I think a good job of a very good job of that. You know, where we discussed at length during the sessions we had was over these issues of distributive justice, and also over the fact that it's not just that things are externalized or out-resourced, if you like, to other countries, but there are many, many situations in country where you have where people who are doing, you know, they dam the river further up, so those further down don't get anything. So there are lots and lots of examples of how the production of produced capital has a massive impact on natural capital, but also does so in very, very uneven ways, and usually manages to contribute to uneven situations that already exist, sort of making them worse rather than ameliorating them. Because obviously, if you're the powerful guys, you're the guys with the dam, you're not the guys with no water and no biodiversity further down.
Henrietta, this question is a slight digression, but given you did extensive field work in Africa earlier in your career, how much is your thinking about some of these issues, about the sort of non-economic and management issues around biodiversity, how much was that influenced by observing how local people in Kenya managed their natural resources around their villages and things?
Well, a huge amount. But I think one of the things I want to say about that is that we we need to recognize that local communities across the globe, and indeed particularly indigenous communities, have storehouses of knowledge for the management of biodiverse systems, which have endured for generations. But we also need to recognize in the modern world that it won't just be enough to say, okay, let's go back to doing what those communities were doing in the past. That isn't going to work. First of all, the changes we've already wrought in these earth systems are sufficient to have speeded up the process of natural capital decline. This is a point that Parter makes. So our world, if you like, is changing more rapidly than it was. So, and the only thing that hasn't changed, well, actually, the only thing that's really grown effectively over time has been human capital, which has grown in a global sense. But actually, natural capital has been going down, and the really big growth has been in produced capital. So we've got, massive skyscrapers and roads and so on everywhere. And the difficulty here, I think, is understanding that we would have to situate these forms of diverse knowledge in the complexity of the world we now inhabit. We can't imagine a world where we say, okay, let's leave everybody with their diverse knowledge to just run their own little bit. And that, in fact, is not what many indigenous leaders and many community leaders are saying. So if you look at what's happening in Africa at the moment, there are quite a number of African organizations which now bring big platforms of farmers together to share knowledge about, sequestering carbon in the soil, managing soils better, managing local seed banks better, getting them to work with local scientists so that they have access to these improved seeds and so on. So it isn't a matter of sort of, if you like, removing science. It's a matter of bringing science and indigenous knowledge together in a way that the diversity of that approach is a benefit to us all. So it's important to recognize that.
I think that's so fascinating, because there is a danger of sort of having a fairly condescending view of indigenous people and wanting to freeze their culture in aspect, which may be not what they want. And
no. And of course, and everybody else, is interested, as we are, in having a charged mobile phone.
Yes, and again, you'll know this very well from Kenya, but the extraordinary reach of mobile phones and mobile phone knowledge into rural agricultural communities in Kenya, far in advance of this country, to be
far in advance of this country, and you can get most of you, your sort of farm support comes through your mobile telephone in Kenya.
Yes.
Right? So of course here we've got all the sort of systems in place, and so there's still, if you like, the possibility for people to be, the vets going to your farm or visiting you, or other support systems for farming and so on to be effective. But in Africa, I mean, the cost of maintaining that is something that's been beyond most African governments for a very, very long time. So actually the mobile phone has really produced an opportunity to share knowledge and to collaborate, which has been quite extraordinary and is extraordinarily important to the future of agriculture for Africa as well.
And Kenya, extraordinary that they deregulated just at the right time, whereas many of their neighbours didn't deregulate, and they had this wonderful ecosystem of individual entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
Henrietta, I suspect we could talk a lot about Kenya, but I'm going to go back to the Dasgupta report. I think one of the things that I did not expect Partha to write so strongly about, and I'm interested in your views as a social anthropologist about this, is the disconnect that many people have from nature today, and the fact how little many people are exposed to nature or natural environments. And I thought he had a wonderful clarion call for especially our children to be more exposed to nature, and for more nature studies to be taught in schools and things. I passed this on to my colleagues in the biology department at Oxford. He argued at one point that everyone coming into university should do an ecology module and things, which rather alarmed the people who teach them. But I did think it was a wonderful argument, and coming from an economist as well, quite strong.
Yes.
Is that something you think is important?
Yeah, I do think this is hugely important. I think it has to be set though in a context. So bug collecting is good fun, and I mean I certainly remember doing bug collecting as a child, or newts. I think we were interested in capturing, as I recall. But it's not that so much as setting this understanding of nature in two very important frames of reference. So the first is the fact that human systems of all kinds are embedded in the natural world in ways which means that what is happening is a process of co-evolution, which we have to continue to be part of. So in other words, it's not going to be possible to manage all of what we need to do in the world by just rewilding half the planet, for example. That's not going to work. But the other is that we do need to teach children in school, I think, something very important, which is what I would call a whole systems approach to understanding the world they live in now. And in that sense, I can see why you would argue for an ecology course for all undergraduates in the first year, rather as you used to argue for a sort of basic economics course. And that's because the intersecting nature of these dynamic nonlinear systems is something that everybody needs to be able to understand. And I think that really is a change of view. It marks the 21st century out quite definitively, I think, from the 20th, even though those ideas arose then. And the other thing it does is for us as intellectuals, it marks the boundary between the kinds of disciplines we've all been involved in, which had their origins in the 19th century and had particular 19th century framings, and forcing us into a situation where we have to realize that we now need to really unpick quite a number of assumptions, including in economics. And so Parter isn't the only person doing that in economics, but although he's a leading figure in this field, to get us out of thinking about societies, for example, as moving towards steady states or towards equilibrium, right? Mm-hmm. This is a problem for us because that's not what's happening in the world and in the societies we're living in now. And I think the next generation really needs to understand that and where to intervene in it.
I'm going to come to questions in 5 minutes, but just before doing that, I'd like to ask you a specific question. And this is about regenerative agriculture, which you've written a lot on recently. And again, if one's interested in biodiversity, one has to think about agriculture and food supply and vice versa, I think now. How did you get interested in that? And tell us a little bit about your recent thoughts on it.
Well, I got interested in it, I think, because of my experience of the fragility of African smallholder agriculture under conditions of fertilizer subsidy for monocropping of maize. And so as soon as that happens, you realize that a number of things, it's not just that you're putting the fertilizer on the fields. I mean, that's something we can come back to in a second. But the fact is that you are reducing the dietary diversity of these communities. Because what tends to happen is that people grow as much maize as they possibly can to try and sell it on the market to make money and then buy everything back again, which is, of course, how you live if you live in Oxford. You don't grow your wheat to eat your bread. It's not necessary. But smallholder agriculture across the world is still going to be the major way of living for many, many, many millions of people well into the next century. So we have to address the fact that that form of agriculture is becoming increasingly precarious, because the old economic model we had of saying to people, okay, well, you will all leave agriculture and you will all move to the city and get employed in something to do with industry or possibly services, et cetera, et cetera. Except we now understand that the numbers of people moving to those cities, there is no formal employment for these people. There's a huge crisis here of the model of economic progress, which we thought was there. So that's one reason why I became very interested in it. Is, in other words, are we telling the story of how our economies and our world is going to evolve? And I actually think there's some quite big holes in it at the moment that we need to address, and informality of labour is one of them. But the other reason is because, being an anthropologist, I'm interested in diversity in all its forms. And one of the things I'm interested in is the diversity of human imagination, the diversity of its capacity for innovation. So in many contexts, it's quite clear to me that we do need to have lots and lots of people involved at the very local levels, including in local farming, regenerating our soils, reducing the toxicity in our waters, diversifying our food systems. Will we be able to feed the whole planet doing just this? No. Right? So what we're looking about here is regenerative agriculture. What role will it play? How significant is it? Each sort of regenerative agricultural aspect that you do, you soon realize when you're working on it that it has to be very specific to the locale, very specific to the soil types, to the seeds, to water availability, to labor availability, to a huge range of things that are important for making it work. And we will still need what we call modern agriculture, but that can be, new types of genetically modified crops. For example, what's happening with rice. So the work that's going on with rice now will mean that there'll be much, much, much less water needed to grow rice, which is such an important crop for so many people in the world. We've got nitrogen, new kinds of crops that can fix nitrogen from the air, which are coming in stream. We've got precision watering systems, which we didn't have before. We've got new ways of controlling pests and so on, and weeds. So we don't have to have these sort of deserts of the prairie, which are going to be, they don't have any longevity, those systems, as they currently are. And I think but we need the diversity of both approaches.
So I couldn't agree more with you on that. And I think one of the barriers to achieving that is an area where actually the social sciences is going to be very, very, very important. And that is to stop destructive polarized narratives arising, which sort of sees the more high intensity farming as totally different from the low intensity farming. It's a spectrum, one needs a variety. And regenerative agriculture, depending on how you define it, it's again a really interesting social science question, how these terms are used. But regenerative agriculture will be as important to the more intense end of the spectrum as it will to the low intense spectrum.
Yes, and also we have to think about how the whole question of global food systems is, talking about the human imagination, I don't know how we ever imagined to create such a system. It is extraordinarily complex and very, very difficult to manage in all its range. But, a country like the United Kingdom, has to bring in food from elsewhere, and understanding what we grow here and how we can live better with what we grow here is an important part of what we do. But we will never be in that situation unless we decide that no one is ever going to eat aubergine again, or whatever it is. Right. And clearly we need practical understandings of this. But the more people who are urban dwellers, the more urban dwellers we have who actually become passionately interested in the question of quality of food and how we grow it and where it comes from, the better.
Henrietta, I'm going to go to some questions now. And the first question is from Macquarie Stewart Harawira, which I suspect might be a New Zealand name. And the question is, the New Zealand Labour government promised at the beginning of its previous term to prioritise well-being. However, this has not continued to be the case. Analysis indicates that the lobbying power of certain industries overcomes such critical endeavours across the board. And in particular, the dairy industry points that. How can governments resist the power of industries that contribute so much to the country's economy?
This is a really terrific question and a hugely important one. And the answer is, I am not entirely sure. In the sense that I'm very often dismayed by the effectiveness of different lobbying bodies, particularly not just of food industry bodies, but also fossil fuel companies and others, and the way in which they can get governments to deviate from a larger policy plan by saying, well, we can create a few jobs in this area, or we can do this, or we can contribute to that. So that here we see the problem of political trade-off. And of course, in these kind of changes we're going to be dealing with, as you realize, there will need to be trade-offs, but there need to be just transitions, and citizens need to have much more oversight over these just transitions. And I think it's by all of us speaking up more about these things that matters. In other words, we cannot have a situation where the British government says it's going to be in favour of, a green transition and then decides to open a new coal mine.
Yes. I do agree with you about the importance of trade-offs, and one can't wish them away, and one will end up having to make compromises.
Yeah.
Joe Flowers, there are a number of questions along this line, so I'm just going to ask one. Joe Flowers asks, politics. How does one get around the fact that politicians, local and national, are looking to the next election, which is surely too short term for dealing with some of the more fundamental issues?
Yes, and that's a very good point again. And what I would say is that what Wales has done is perhaps a way forward here for us to think about as a possibility. So they have passed a Future Generations Act, which means that any legislation that the National Assembly considers has to fulfill criteria with regard to its impact on future generations. And some of the stuff that's coming out of Wales now, because of that Future Generations Act, is truly innovative. For example, in some of the Welsh valleys, communities have been told that standing in their village and looking up at the hills around them, that land will be given to them for their future well-being, provided that they create businesses and activities which improve the quality of life for future generations. So to have that kind of imaginative idea of what you would do with this future generation perspective, I think is really important. And of course, New Zealand is trying to do that, and the WellBeing Alliance, which includes Iceland and Scotland and lots of other people now as well, are also trying to do similar things. So I think what you need is a longer term framework which isn't derailed by whether or not you're Conservative or Labour or Green or whatever, the power play that goes on between generations.
I strongly second your comments about the really interesting things happening in Wales at the moment. Do you think that sometimes it's a bit too convenient to blame politicians the whole time? I don't normally quote Jean-Claude Juncker, but he said, often we politicians know what to do. What we don't know is how to get elected once we've done it.
Yes, well, I think he did have a very good point there, and I think that we should all of us think about the short-termism of our own thinking. And I think if we thought that government policy was much more directly addressed to solving problems at the local level, then I think it would make a difference in terms of people's own commitment to voting for people who do see through these things. So one thing I often say when I'm asked about this is, let's think about one of the biggest problems for people across Europe at the moment, which is the cost of housing. And this is particularly important in the UK. And housing costs a lot of money for people, but it also produces 40% of all emissions in the UK come from households, if you take waste into account and all the rest of it. And part of that problem is that we're currently paying people who are elderly, who live in houses, to be able to burn enough fuel to keep themselves warm during the winter. So why don't we just change the policy, retrofit the house so they never get a bill again, and sort out the economics, right?
Question from Alan Hayes. Now, Alan points out to the extraordinary things that happened at the last Exxon shareholders meeting, where a group called Engine Number One managed to get together a group that has got, so Alan says 3 seats on the Exxon board. I knew it was 2 and they were thinking of the third, and hope he's right that it's 3. So an example of the investor community actually bringing about change. Alan asks, can investment, and I guess the investor communities, help with levelling up and with, to expand it slightly, to getting the corporate sector to be more sustainable?
Yeah, I think they can, and I think there's a huge amount that can be done there. So one issue, of course, is the question of investment. And and where you see the return on that investment. So one of the difficulties is that all of these big companies and the financial institutions around them need to be involved in the process of shaping future markets. So it's not just a matter of how do you make lots and lots of money out of the markets as they currently are, but how do you shape the future market? So a really good example for that for the United Kingdom would be the renewables market. So if you go back a few years, even only a few years, people would say things like, well, we'll never be able to produce enough out of renewable energy to, really get rid of fossil fuels. That debate has shifted dramatically. And it was shifted only by a combination of investment, financial investment into renewables, shaping and regulating the renewables market, making it more attractive and allowing companies and so on to invest in it. So there is a big role, but there's also a big role for the big pension holders as well in redirecting this investment to long-term investment and to not looking all the time for very, very short-term and immediate returns. And part of that is about how do we get quickly, for example, for me, and one of the things I'm very exercised about is how do we leave many of these fossil fuels as stranded assets? How do we leave them in the ground, right? And a lot of that is about how we will manage the finance sector. So why don't we have many more green bonds? Why don't we have, for the Build Back Better for the UK particularly, those have been suggested. And I think there are lots and lots of things that could be done there. But the big change for business is that business has to think more about the long-term benefits of being a long-term business as opposed to how do you get short-term profit. And that is really difficult. That's a long-term thing. And some businesses manage it very well. I mean, IKEA, for example, has managed investment, and the pension fund for IKEA managed investment into social housing, into things which do make a very good return for the pension fund, but they're very, very long-term. They're not about immediate ways of running a business.
So is that a problem with the Anglo-Saxon business model, the tyranny of the quarterly report, as opposed to IKEA from, and it's a bit crass to say it as quite as separate to this, as a sort of Central European supervisory board type model?
Yeah, I mean, lots of people have made that argument. And actually, at the moment, we've got someone in the IGP working on precisely this, looking at, what has happened with the quarterly report, what happens with the annual report and the AGM meetings, and why it's important. Do the shareholders actually raise anything with management? And it turns out that they very rarely do. So they make noises behind the scenes, but they very rarely raise them at the AGM. So by the time you get to the AGM, lots of decisions will already have been made. So it's really about changing the long-term management of the company's objectives, I think. And so we've done some good work on this shift between, stakeholder and shareholder, and whether it's the form of the company that's of the limited company that's the problem.
Just going back to the previous question, I think that's one of the reasons why the engine number one initiative in Exxon was so extraordinary. And at least reading what the Economist said about the meeting, it completely nonplussed Exxon, who had to go away in a dark room to see if they could reverse it, and did not seem to be able to. Are you a fan of disclosure as a means of getting better practice in the corporate sector? So we have a lot about climate disclosure, and we're beginning to see things about nature disclosure. And again, it's criticized as just being greenwashing. Do you think that can be a force for good? No,
I think it can be a force for good, because I think all of these things need all of the institutions we have in our lives. So businesses, governments, educational institutions and so on. We need to be much more aware of where they are investing their money and how they are managing their long-term future, because actually they're involved in managing our long-term future. So all of those forms of disclosure. And I think one of the things I would say is I'd like to see, and I've been writing a bit about this, the climate emergency and the biodiversity crisis as seen as an intertwined emergency, rather than one and the other, right, going together. So I'd be very keen to see disclosure on nature-based things as well. I think that would be hugely important.
I think there's wind in the sails of that movement. I think really what's happened over the last 18 months is really encouraging. Let me go to another question. It's just initials, DH. I don't imagine it's DH Lawrence. How diverse are views on what contributes to prosperity, and how do we balance different wants? What if I value undisturbed countryside, but you want high-speed trains and more housing? So I guess there's difference in economics there, but I suspect what DH is getting at is people have different values, and these may not be commensurate. How does one deal with that in a democracy?
Well, that's an extremely good question, because the first thing is we have to understand is that prosperity itself is an emergent property of a complex assemblage on the ground. So a social and an ecological and an environmental and an economic assemblage. So how it works in each place is going to be slightly different. And that diversity is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. Mm-hmm. So when we adapt the prosperity index for particular areas, we are, of course, we have elements in it that are comparative so that we can compare across and then understand bigger trends in the economy and stuff. But also what we're looking at is what are the top things that need action in that area for people themselves. And that process is a process of working with communities. And over time, what you tend to get in that process is a number of things bubble up to the top of what are the top 5 or 6. Now, that doesn't mean that you can have everything you want in a notion of prosperity. Because if, for example, everybody in a community suddenly decided that prosperity for them meant everybody had to have a personal swimming pool, this would not be environmentally sustainable, nor would it long-term be actually a form of socially sustainable prosperity. Right? So there are issues here about people's different values, but what's most important is how we negotiate them. When they're in conflict, and they can be in conflict, but at the local level, what you tend to find is a great deal of solid social solidarity comes out of this process of working on what is prosperity for us together at that level. So that some of that is done there. The question of how you deal with the fact that Birmingham wants to have a high-speed rail link and those people who are living right next to where it's going to come into London don't want it is a perennial problem of government. But that's not really about the prosperity itself, the understanding of prosperity.
And I guess it relates to your point very early on about we're going to have to devolve more decision making down to more local levels.
Yeah.
If we want that, if we want more sensible decisions to be made that affect the lives of people in the local place. But that, I guess, the more decision-making centers you have, the more capacity there is for disagreement. And how does one navigate that? And again, it's easier if you're authoritarian China, but much harder in a democracy.
It is much harder in a democracy. But I think one of the issues is to think about the fact that we are already locally, so we just speak about the UK for a moment because we're here in the UK, but we are already, all of our communities, very diverse. And so we already have to negotiate that diversity. And in fact, diversity is itself a strength because different people bring in different and innovative solutions. And so when you bring people together to solve problems, you have all of their imaginative capacities. When you only have one set of people with one set of fixed ideas, then they're only going to come with their one fixed idea. So diversity in this thing is a good. It's a public good in a way. So that has to be how we have to work with democracy, because we can't, for example, in the UK have people deciding that they're not going to allow anybody into their area who doesn't look like them.
Yes. A final question. This is from Sophie Taylor. How might the index, I think this is the prosperity well-being index you were talking about, help value spiritual or bequest value largely within indigenous and Aboriginal cultures?
Yeah, and that's a very good question. And I think the way it does that is by looking at what would be ways of representing those spiritual values within the index itself. So very often that's about protecting mountains or protecting waterways or protecting particular ways of being able to manage and own the land and have a relationship of kinship with the land and so on. So that those issues we're working on actively at the moment. So thank you for asking that question in the work that we're doing in Kenya, because one of the things that really makes a difference in doing the prosperity index in Kenya as opposed to doing it here in central London is that here in central London, people hardly ever mention the environment except for green spaces, by which they mean parks, right? In Kenya, almost all of the prosperity index is environment. Plus tarmac roads and some other things, but mostly the things that people really care about are in broadly what we would call that space. And so you see those things reflected in a way.
Henrietta, I want you to ask a final question. We've been through an extraordinary time in the last 18 months with the pandemic. Hopefully we're coming out of it. Mm-hmm. Hopefully you've been vaccinated with the Oxford vaccine. But as a social anthropologist and looking back about what we have gone through communally over this 18 months, a pandemic which has really stressed the interconnectedness, has made government do things that are unprecedented in peacetime. How much do you think that that is going to change the way we approach some of these other issues? So I'm not thinking about the pandemic now. I'm thinking about issues such as biodiversity and climate change, but I guess also equality as well, economic disparities. Do you think, in a couple of years, will we be just back to status quo ante, or do you think it will have made a difference?
No, I think it will have made a difference, because I think that one of the things that it's made a difference to is the younger generation. I think that it's clearer to them now the kinds of actions that they would like to take and the things that they would like to see happening. And I think the more we can speed up that process, I think that, for me, if I compare it to not just 2 years ago, but also to sort of 40 years ago, the discussion about biodiversity, I don't remember anybody even mentioning biodiversity. So we have come a very, very long way. And we've seen many, many other changes which have had that capacity to be a very slow burn and then push forward. So gay marriage was one of them, for example, which nobody ever thought would happen. And then it did. It turned very quickly, and it turned because there were enough people who suddenly thought, honestly, what is this about? We need to be doing this. And I think that the biodiversity is one of those things. What's more difficult is that we do have really deeply embedded systems of profit and elitism and gain that are going to be very difficult to unseat. And it's there that we need to have people working in all those businesses. So as you come up and go out into jobs, that's what needs to change.
Actually, it's 2 minutes to go, so I can slip in a final question. So, Henrietta, Rishi Sunak calls you into his wonderful office in the Treasury and says, I've just finished reading Parth's 400-page report, and you can see his tired hands. And he asks you, what is the priority of legislation I need to bring in now? What should I do first?
Well, I think the priority would be to bring in a form of inclusive wealth accounting that Partha is asking for, but also to make sure that it becomes the backbone of the way you think about the changes you want to see in ELMS, that is, in the management of our own landscape and farming systems.
Just to interrupt there, so ELMS is a scheme that they're bringing in that will help support rural communities, the substitute for the Common Agricultural Policy.
You have to make those different parts of policy work together. So the Environment Land Management Scheme has to work alongside the idea that natural capital accounting will be part of this inclusive wealth, and that therefore you will adequately recompense farmers for managing public goods. Yeah,
and that it might happen. Let's keep our fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed.
Henrietta, just before thanking you, let me thank everyone else, everyone who's joined us this afternoon for some really super questions, and apologies for the people whose questions I didn't get to. There is one more talk in this series. It's on the 17th of June. It's not at our normal time. It's at 12:30. And it's with Natalie Seddon, who's at Oxford, who's an expert in nature-based solution. And she'll be talking to my colleague, Cameron Hepburn. Henrietta, that was the most fascinating conversation. Thank you so much. You bring a really fascinating perspective to these issues. We're enormously grateful for you spending time with us this afternoon. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Charles. Lovely. All right.